Good morning to all of our guests here today, and welcome to those of you joining us from around the world. Thank you all for participating in this important Atlantic Council Eurasia Center event and what I know will be a thought-provoking discussion. The evolution of the modern battle space represents an industrial revolution that is occurring weekly and often daily in the vast arena of electronic warfare, unmanned vehicles, air, naval, and ground, early warning, and countermeasures. Our panelists today are experts in understanding this battle space for which supply chains, production, and dynamic flexibility are critical elements. As Ukraine has demonstrated, the old methods of production, which are often prohibitively expensive, time-consuming, and resistant to change, will no longer suffice in this new environment, nor will dependencies on countries that have decided we in the West are the enemy. As we will hear today, we should never mortgage our future security to those who seek to do us harm. We have an impressive panel today, and I want to get started so we can hear from our experts so you just don't have to hear from me droning on, every pun intended there. So first, we have Katarina Buchatsky, Director of Analytics at Snake Island Institute and co-founder of the Shadows Project. We have Laura Cooper, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. We have Commander Nick, his call sign. He wants me to use his call sign, and I respect that. He's the leader of the drone pilot section in the 412th Nemesis Regiment of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. And lastly, speaking to us from Vilnius today, we have Daniel Soler, the Vice President of International Operations at Mission Essential, who's currently partnering with Ukrainian companies for reconstruction projects and drone technology development. And with that, I turn to Kat. Please lead us in.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for being here today. Snake Island Institute, where I'm Director of Analytics, has been recently working on exploring what exactly the challenges are in scaling Ukraine's drone industrial production base, because as we've learned, we've built the most dynamic drone industry in the Western world. The other two most dynamic drone industries in the world are Russia's and China's, and it's not a position we want to be in where we're outnumbered by our adversaries. And in the last few years since the full-scale invasion, Ukraine has really been able to transform from a very, very small industrial base that was producing about 5,000 units annually to now over 2.1 million per year of unmanned systems. It's incredibly impressive. But that production miracle did not come without a lot of acute strategic vulnerabilities, particularly on China. So I'm going to walk through today a little bit of our biggest takeaways from our recent report, which we partnered with on the Ukrainian Council of Defense Industries, polling their manufacturers to understand their challenges. So I want to start with the accomplishments before we get to the challenges. So in 2022, Ukraine imported about 500,000 drones primarily from China. About 97% came in from China, and we're producing only about 3,000 to 5,000 domestically. So that means they're importing over 500,000 entire drone systems. By 2024, it's now at about 2.1 million units produced domestically, and 95% assembled in Ukraine. Assembled being the key word here because we haven't fully localized production of all the critical components. Right now, our defense minister says that we need about 400,000 unmanned systems per month to be competitive with Russia, and Ukraine is producing about 200,000 of those. So we're at about 50% the production capacity that we need to be competitive with our adversaries, so there's still a very long way to go. But it's still incredibly impressive so far that we've been able to switch from importing entire units to assembling in-house. No other nation is able to do this in the Western world. Domestic assembly expanded, so of course the import of components started increasing, which is where we really started to see the strategic vulnerabilities to Chinese dependency, because if in early 2023 we were importing about $10 million of Chinese components, in 2024 it's over $40 million a month in component imports, and total 2024 monthly was about $135 million versus $17.6 million in 2023. We got very impressive assembly sovereignty, but are still very much struggling with localization of components sovereignty. And so the industrial base scaled very rapidly, but because it's primarily coming on imported components, it means that it's also at risk of a very rapid collapse, because at any moment, if those components are restricted and we aren't able to get the access to the types of motors that we need, batteries, propellers, et cetera, it means that our production is severely crippled. So this is not full industrial independence quite yet. 90% of the component imports were coming from China in January of 2024. We've actually been sort of successful over the last year in diversification, and that was actually in part to China's help, because they started export restrictions on certain critical components, which means that we weren't able to access them anymore, and we were forced to look for alternatives. So about 70.6% of our manufacturers say that they would abandon Chinese components if they were able to. So the demand is there. The market is there for localized components, and there's certainly big buyers. So if you remember the numbers earlier, these are buyers of millions and millions of systems per year. And for each FPV drone, if you have 4 motors, then you can do the math that it's in the tens of millions of motors that we're willing to buy. So the market is there. We just have not been able to get the same access to the Western manufacturers as the Chinese manufacturers. They don't match in terms of scale, in terms of speed, and in terms of quality and price oftentimes. And thanks to the Chinese export restrictions, we've been able to partially diversify. So if you see a little bit there, the number of imports coming from the EU has grown, but America is missing there. We still have, in the single digits of percentage of components coming from the United States. And that's in large part because of not only industrial capacity, but also because of the export restrictions for American components to come into Ukraine. A lot of our manufacturers said that they've struggled with, as soon as an American manufacturer knows that the component's end game is to get into Ukraine, they restrict access. They're not able to buy anymore because they're worried about something or another. So the EU is growing its presence in the Ukrainian supply chain, and there's certainly a big market there. The US is still very much missing. China has certainly been weaponizing the supply chain issue when it comes to Ukraine. So here you can see what types of components have been already affected by export restrictions on a standard FPV drone. It's quite a lot of the critical ones, so propellers, motors, frames, FPV cameras, et cetera. The frames and the frame components we've actually had really, really good luck on in localization in Ukraine. So about 85% of airframes are now made locally, but the rest of the components we're still struggling to find alternatives. So this is where there are critical needs in order to, for Western countries and for Western companies to step in and fill that market gap. Most of the problem with importing Chinese restrictions is delays with customs and logistics, certification issues. So most of the manufacturers said that thanks to the Chinese weaponization of this, that they face severe delays. Another issue is China's special industrial relationship with Russia, meaning that China actually places Russian orders ahead of any sort of Ukrainian orders. Even though there are export restrictions, Ukrainian manufacturers, it's very loosely enforced, so Ukrainian manufacturers are still sometimes able to negotiate with Chinese ones, but China plays a game where if they know that there's a Russian buyer and there's a Ukrainian buyer, they will give them to the Russian buyer first. They'll also allow Russia to buy up entire supply lines if they find out that a Ukrainian manufacturer is going after this. So we've very much had anecdotes from manufacturers where they had found a certain motor factory in China and they were set aside 100,000 motors for them. The Russians find out that they were buying those 100,000 motors from China and put in a bid for double the price and bought out the entire supply line so that Ukrainian manufacturers couldn't have access to that. This is something that the Russians invest in heavily, so they know that we're fighting over the same pot of gold, they know that we're fighting over the same components, and they're willing to put in double the price, triple the price in order to restrict our access to those supply lines. So they buy them up. The Chinese firms continue to export to Russian companies despite any sort of sanctions, and Russian firms not only will buy up the supply lines, but also buy up the entire production line and relocalize it into Russia. So then they will actually have access to that within the country. They will buy up the IP. They will get that knowledge. So they're investing in a long-term, sustainable, local components manufacturing, because it means that they know the knowledge, they now have the IP, and are able to produce it for years and years without being reliant on China. Ukraine, meanwhile, doesn't have that same capability because this is in the hundreds of millions of dollars to be able to do that, to buy the Chinese IP, to relocalize, et cetera. And so it's a long-term investment that Russia's making, and in I don't know how many years, there's going to be an exponential growth in their capabilities to manufacture their own components and therefore continue to scale their own industrial base. Meanwhile, we will continue to be crippled if we go along the same route and don't invest in our own manufacturing capability and diversifying from China. This is kind of an overview map of where we're currently getting most of our components from. So airframes, hulls, chassis have been about 85% domestically localized in Ukraine, partially localized battery packs, cameras, a little bit here and there. But again, a lot of things now coming from the EU, some from Australia, very few from the United States. The biggest disadvantage, of course, is price. So the cost effectiveness of getting a component from the EU or from the United States is that it's double, triple the price, quadruple sometimes, and some governments can afford to invest in materials like that. Ukraine can't, especially if we're talking about wars at scale, economies at scale. Like this actually adds up a lot over time, and we can't possibly afford to be investing in components that are 3 or 4 times the price in order to make an FPV drone that's going to be used in 10 minutes and discarded, and it's not really relevant for the supply line of an attritable system. So that's one of the challenges, and one of the challenges in us localizing and buying more from the EU. This is not really just Ukraine's problem, it's a mirror problem. The US has dealt with this before when China slapped sanctions on Skydio, and the US is thinking a lot as well about Chinese components in its own systems. And so Ukraine, I think, actually provides a really, really valuable opportunity and alternative here for US companies and the US government, because no other drone industry has been able to scale assembly like this. No other drone industry knows what it takes and how to produce these millions of systems annually. And replicating this, even though we still have a problem with components from China, replicating this kind of manufacturing capability is something that takes years and something that takes a lot of investment, and also something that takes know-how. So one of the most valuable things in the Chinese assembly lines is their IP and the fact that they know how to do this and they know how to produce these systems. So Ukraine has this kind of proven industrial capacity where I think the West could really step up, and where there's a lot of opportunities for collaboration is for NATO to have a long-term investment into having those components be localized better in the EU and in the US, and feeding them into the Ukrainian supply line, because Ukraine knows how to assemble them at speed, at scale, at cost effectively. We are just missing some of those critical components that we can't invest in right now. So there's kind of 2 paths forward here. Either absorb the integration cost now, which is what Russia is doing. They are signing multi-year contracts, hundreds of millions of dollars, investing into projects that are localizing these lines within the country because they know that this will pay off years down the line. Or we can continue to wait and we can inherit this exposure later. Ukraine is already inheriting a lot of this exposure, to be quite frank. I'm very afraid of the day that if China decides to wake up and just restrict access to all of this, our industrial base will very quickly collapse. Everything that we know how to do, the millions of systems that we're able to assemble, they are all still very much dependent. And so it's kind of a ticking time bomb, and it's something that our adversaries know and are investing in now, and we haven't put the same investment into quite yet. So supply chain cooperation is very, very strategic for the long-term success of any Western alliance, because that's how you win wars, that's how you remain competitive, and that's how you defend yourself. And the modern supply chains are already being contested. So we need to think about what we're going to be doing in return, and how the Western world is going to step up to challenge our adversaries' competitiveness. Thank you.
Thanks, Kat.
Thank you.
Please join us here. Next, I'm going to ask Nick to give us the perspective of someone who's been at the front lines and knows what's going on, and talks about the implications of what's happening here. Because what we like to do here is to give you the big picture here, but then let you know about the everyday. And I think it's critical to have the commander here, because this is the future of modern warfare. This is what we're all going to be looking at in the West. So I think it's good to hear firsthand from someone who's lived it. So please.
Yeah, hi everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank you actually about US support. We feel it all the time. And what about the frontline reality? Before 2022, I wasn't a military at all. I was a bartender, and it was my first 2 years. I was a part of infantry unit. I was understand how it works on the front line by walking by the feet, and I was seeing the dynamic of the increasing of UAV's component from the start till this period, what we have now. And actually, my first experience connecting with the drone component, it was, I was flying actually like a DJI Mavic 3 drone pilot, just air intelligence for the tactic level. And for now, what I'm doing in my regiment, it's more about heavy bombing striking mission. We have our Nemesis, big heavy bomber type, and it's totally different what we had before. Also, the component of FPV drones make logistic on the front line very hard, from both sides actually. Like if previously in 2023 you can come closer to the position by some pickup, maybe 3 kilometers, and then continue walking. So now 10 kilometers area from both sides, it's a kill zone. So many different UAVs flying, intelligence and striking systems. And it's like totally different situation what we have now.
Thank you so much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Laura Cooper, who has had a significant amount of experience and is responsible for putting together this coalition to support Ukraine. And we're delighted to also have Laura here today. Please.
Thanks, Deborah, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for hosting Snake Island Institute. I think the word of the day for us in the United States and in our NATO allied countries is humility. We have a lot to learn from our Ukrainian partners, and I really appreciate that the Snake Island Institute is bringing some of those lessons to us, even as you continue with your mission of educating Ukrainian soldiers about lessons learned. My caveat before I give you just 3 observations designed to spark discussion is that, I come from a government background. So I have great confidence that industry colleagues would have a very different perspective on what I describe as industry challenges. So with that caveat, I thought I'd offer 3 observations that I think are pertinent to this supply chain diversification challenge that really has tremendous urgency that we just heard about. So the first observation relates to this is a familiar challenge, and yet it's unfamiliar territory. Familiar because from the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion in Ukraine, we were struggling to ramp up production. And the refrain that we heard time and again, and this probably applies to just about any NATO country that was trying to ramp up production of munitions in particular, was that we can get you the factory capacity, but the supply chain choke points are really the big challenge. We dealt with this pretty extensively when it came to both ammunition production and air defense interceptor production, and we're still dealing with it to this day. So this is not a wholly solved problem. We also would hear the refrain, time and again, get us the contracts. We need to get this on contract in order to solve this supply chain choke point issue. So I think we have to keep that in the back of our minds when we're thinking about how can industry work. And I'll circle back to that point about funding later. But what's not really familiar still to us in Washington or in our defense industry is just how different Ukraine defense industry is operating. The rapid adaptation, the bottom-up nature that you just heard a little inkling about. The requirements for new drones are being established by units, small units in the field, who are then interacting directly with industry to iterate and adapt what they're producing. This is amazing for innovation, but when you think about the model of Western industry, it's really hard for us to partner with such a different paradigm. And I think this is something that we have to all give a lot of thought to when it comes to adaptation. And that brings me to my second point, which is a point about collaboration. The scale and scope of this challenge, when you look at the pervasive nature of Chinese components in not just Ukrainian drones, but a lot of our allies' drones as well, I have no doubt, is something that cannot be solved by working through stovepipes of individual companies or individual countries. We are going to have to work together to have a systematic approach. The investments will come from individual countries. NATO doesn't spend on its own. It's member states that spend money. But we need a coordinated approach. And I think we can take a page from the playbook that we developed in the past 3 years with the capability coalitions. So these are groups of countries that came together to essentially adopt aspects of Ukraine force structure and to figure out who is purchasing which capability when, and when will it deliver, to give the Ukrainians a better sense of what was in the pipeline, and also to make sure that everybody was focused on the right requirements for today's force and for the future force. And this construct really brought to light some of these supply chain issues when we looked at artillery in particular. And I think there's a little bit of an analogous issue here. When it came to ammunition, in the early days of the war, we started discovering that all of our countries, with the best of intentions, along with Ukraine, were looking at the same sources of ammunition around the world. And we were also challenged by the same supply constraints in terms of the components that go into ammunition. So having a coordination mechanism to raise visibility and to be able to deconflict was incredibly important. And I think when you look at the drone challenge, you have to wonder, what kind of a mechanism do we need to be able to bring us together? I think the Drone Capability Coalition might offer great potential here. It's up and running. It's been focusing on purchasing ready-made drones, but this would be another area to focus on. NATO has been doing interesting work in this area. The NATO Procurement Agency, NSPA, has looked at some of these critical minerals, critical components. So I think we have the ingredients to be able to pull together some kind of an international effort. But this brings me to the third point, which is urgency and funding. And I think at this point, we are struggling to make sure that we have reliable funding streams to support Ukraine's security assistance. Here is where I think the most important thing for us to try to unveil are these co-production win-win opportunities where we're making the case that we're making investments that benefit our country, that benefit NATO, and that benefit Ukraine. And we're finding ways to embed our investments into Ukraine's supply chain so that they have a resilient approach. This is not easy. Again, I go back to the very different operating models and cultures of our respective organizations. But it's also true that intellectual property plays a big role here and is not something to just shrug off. There are some difficult issues to work through, but it's imperative that we find this sense of urgency for our own NATO needs and for Ukraine's needs, and that we work together for this challenge. There are sources of funding that haven't been tapped into. Many of you are aware of the US-Ukraine joint fund that was set up as part of the critical minerals deal. Not only would the critical minerals deal enable production of minerals that could be used in some of these components, it also enables US investments to count, US security assistance investments to count towards the investment fund. So that's an opportunity that hasn't been tapped into. And then of course we have the Europeans working on potential ways to tap into Russian sovereign frozen assets. This could be a real game changer in resources for Ukraine's defense industry and for Ukraine's security needs. I will stop there.
Thanks so much. And I think that lays the groundwork and for Dan here, because we're going to put this squarely in your lap, and you're going to tell us how U.S. industry can partner with Ukraine and do it in such a way that we're respecting Ukraine's intellectual property and paying them enough of the profits so that they can fund their country and not just be a recipient of international assistance going forward, because that's critically important for Ukraine's future, and how U.S. companies can help with this dynamic in being, as I like to call it, faster, better, cheaper than the normal model that we use to do contracting and weapons in this country. So Dan, over to you.
Yeah, hey, Deborah, thank you and the Atlantic Council for this opportunity to offer our insights on this important topic. With Mission Essential, I run their international operations, and we have very substantial business interests in Europe. We've been there for a long time, and we're continuing to grow our business in Europe as we speak. And I'm talking to you now from Vilnius, Lithuania, where I've been meeting with government officials and others to support their defensive efforts to include drone production, as well as the drone wall initiative that was recently unveiled by the northeastern European countries here. And that's an effort designed to detect, track, and neutralize hostile Russian drones. And I think all of you know very much the significance of this, given the recent incursions in Poland, Romania, and now it appears possibly Denmark and Norway. I was also in Ukraine last week, meeting with several drone manufacturers and partners to better understand the rapidly evolving drone technology across drone types, ranging from FPV drones, that's first-person viewer drones, interceptors, mid and long range, and ISR drones, and also the ability to scale up this production to greater levels. As already mentioned by Katerina up front, this is the big demand right now, is to grow this, double it, quintuple it, whatever the number is, to vast numbers, much greater than what we are. And I appreciate, just from my visit there this week, and this is my third trip here to Ukraine this year, but what Laura said up front is we can learn a lot from the Ukrainians, and humility is an important part of that. And I can tell you that was my watchword when I went in there this week, talking to several drone manufacturers. I realized that even my own experience with the Department of Defense pales in comparison to theirs and recent activities that they're doing, and we can learn a lot from this. The characteristics of war are changing right now. I won't call it a revolution, but it's perhaps an evolution of military affairs that we're facing right now, and it's pretty significant. I want to talk kind of broadly on a couple of big things. What's already helping? This is both the production of drones, but also businesses in that effort. And then the second is kind of the mitigation playbook. And there's a number of things my colleagues have already addressed here, so I'll try to avoid most of those, and I'll try to hit a couple of things that are new, but also accentuate a couple of things that were already mentioned. So first off is one, I think that if you're going to scale this up and also protect the production facilities, you're going to have to find a way of producing outside of Ukraine, preferably near the Ukrainian borders, but you could scale up outside where things are going to be a little bit safer. I give this as an example of one of the companies that I met this week and this last week in Kyiv. They're at about 15,000 drones of all types every month, and that's growing. But there's a number of limb facts that we've already talked about. They've also emphasized, the scarcity or the paucity of Chinese parts that they've been recently getting or been failing to get. That's been a challenge for them. But it's also just, frankly, safe production facilities. A few months ago, they had about a dozen or more Shahed strikes on their production facilities, damaged a lot of their stuff. They've since then rebuilt that and built TTPs in place that when they hear about a drone strike potentially coming from, or a missile strike from the Russian side, they have TTPs in place where they'll actually pick up their drones and put them onto trucks very rapidly and then move them out of the area. So that mitigates the risk or minimizes the risk to them. But that's something that's very near and dear to them. But I think you can mitigate a lot of that by doing this outside of Ukraine, which then kind of gets into, that's already happening. The Denmark model I'll come back to a little bit. That's the first good example of that, but there's other countries to include Lithuania, Romania, and the United Kingdom that are involved in that as well. Laura also mentioned the Capability Coalition that's led by Latvia with UK. I think that's a great initiative. I'm not in the middle of that, but everything I hear coming out of that is very, very positive. And what that does is that finds ways of making it easier for businesses such as mine to be able to get into that market. There's another out there that's, I know that Laura touched on this on the U.S.-Ukraine Fund, which is part of the CRM deal that was signed earlier this year. That's one initiative for U.S. companies, which is very positive. But for European companies European countries, in addition to NSPA, there's also what's called the EU SAFE instrument, which is a security action for Europe, which creates opportunities to take out loans to buy drone production capabilities and parts for the use there. So these are some of the things that are already working that still could be expanded, and there's many, many more. I'll just hit a few things that are actually, some of the mitigation measures that we should consider. And I know these are being considered in other quarters, but this is something I think would help out significantly. One is, I'll say, license once, ship to many. So for example, and I'll use the U.S. as example. U.S. has the Blue UAS initiative that was started about 5 years ago under DIU. It's in the process of being transferred now to the Defense Contract Management Agency as we speak. So that will essentially take UAS components, parts, pieces, or even full drones and approve them for sale to U.S. organizations. I know there is initiatives ongoing inside of NATO to do the same thing, but I think it would make a big difference if NATO did the same thing to standardize and approve, essentially pre-approve NATO drones and parts for NATO. And optimally, in a perfect world, it would be universal, meaning it would also meet U.S. standards. And that's one of the things that we're very much interested in facilitating as we conduct our business here in Europe. I've already mentioned the Denmark model. That's been the biggest success. That was an agreement signed earlier this year between Denmark and the Ukraine to be able to do production inside of Denmark of Ukrainian companies there. That's a good initiative. I don't know that it's substantial enough. I think there's a number of other companies that would like to get into that. And as I said, I know Lithuania I'm talking to them. They have a letter of intent to do something like that as well that could be expanded upon. I touched on this briefly about standardization of parts, meaning if you can standardize controllers, ESCs, standardize some of the things that are kind of universal. So you only train a pilot one time on one type of kit and not on 3 or 4 different types. It's hard to play PlayStation 5 and then go to Xbox if you're used to one or the other. There's similarities, but they're quite different. So if you have the similar controllers and similar operating schemes, that makes it a little bit easier for the training of pilots. It also keeps costs down. And when you're a business, that's also very important. And then kind of related to that is also coalition level vendor pools. So if you start creating these vendor pools in Europe of either parts or drones themselves, that can be quickly accessed not only for Ukraine, but also for other NATO partners, particularly as you're building out the drone wall. Then you essentially have a bench stock there that they can leverage on. That again keeps costs down, and it also improves standardization. I think I'll pause there at this point, Deborah, and I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So what I'd like to do is just put one general question out here and ask you all to jump in and say what you'd like on this. So one of the common themes that has come through here is this outsized dependency on China. And as we began at the top of this session, we talked about how relying on someone who considers you an adversary is willing to sell you stuff, get you hooked, and then cut you off. It's like the ultimate bad drug dealer. And so how do we get around that, especially when we know that without China's considerable assistance, Russia's defense industry would grind to a halt? So we know whose side Russia is on, and we know what side China is on. And we talked about standardization of parts. So how do we change the dynamic in the West of a more slow and plodding way of doing contracting, of resourcing materials, of getting things done, and getting rid of that outsized dependent on a country who seeks to do us harm? How do we change our mindset of contracts that you sign and then it takes 3 years to fulfill? Because we don't have 3 years anymore. It's not the way the modern battle space is working. So all of these great ideas of looking 5 years into the future, it doesn't work anymore because in a year, all of that's going to be OBE. So I throw this out to all of our participants here to look at how do you change this? How do you make sure your components are being processed? Who do you partner with? I've always said that the US cannot face that pacing threat from China all by itself. Its defense industry is great, but not that good. So how do we get at this and fix this, not only for Ukraine's existential future, but for all of ours? And so anyone who wants to start taking that, please.
I can jump in here. I think one of the challenges is there's a lot of conversation about the US industrial base supporting this kind of manufacturing development in Europe, stepping up a little more, but I haven't seen that the United States and Europe are fully ready to integrate their supply lines with Ukraine yet, which I also think poses a major challenge, because when we saw that graph of where the components are coming from, yes, there's a growing EU supply line going into Ukraine. The US is still at 1%, 2%, 3%, and that's not all in part to a lack of industrial capacity. It's also in part to export restrictions that European and American countries have of their technologies going into Ukraine. And our manufacturers have also cited qualms with European manufacturers in particular when they've said, you know, we want to buy up a particular component from a European country and they have an adequate supply, we want to buy it, it's important for us, the price is reasonable, but they can't because the government restricted that sale. And I'm not familiar with every European country and the US's export restrictions on those type of components, but I also know that it's a part of it that's market economics. Ukraine is the biggest buyer of these types of components. Ukrainian drone companies are looking to China and buying up in the hundreds of thousands, multi-million-dollar contracts. Ukraine's procurement system adapts quickly. We procure fast. We give people contracts at quick timelines, and we are looking to buy. But the US and Europe are not always ready to sell. So there's also that aspect of it that I think is super important, because is the US and Europe ready to give us those types of critical components for us to support our own industrial base, and also for them to have those kind of contracts? Like, it's not always going to be coming from the US government or the European governments, but Ukraine is a buyer, and you know, we're not always able to buy.
So I'm looking at Laura here because the one question that comes in mind is, we have made our rules and regulations based on letting the non-proliferation people make policy, and that's now hurting us. So how do we tackle this export control piece, which is now only hurting us and not helping our friends and allies?
Well, this is going to seem like a cop-out, but we have a regulatory infrastructure that needs to be adapted and reformed. We also have a kind of military planning infrastructure that needs to be energized. And we're treating this as though there will be kind of one solution to all of the critical dependencies, but actually there will be, dozens of different solutions under one big umbrella. That big umbrella is kind of what I was loosely describing as, a capability coalition-like structure. But I mean, the Snake Island Institute has done a great job of providing detailed information about specific critical commodities and components that are found in specific locations, not just in China. And that's kind of a starting point that needs to be bumped up against NATO countries' plans for their own drone production. I think you'll see some commonalities, and some NATO countries will realize it's in their self-interest to be investing in some of these areas, and bumped up against security assistance plans for Ukraine. And I think that will tease out some of the most glaring areas to work on from a regulatory standpoint. Because, I mean, I was never one of the export control people. I was never one of the regulators. But my understanding was always that they dealt in very specific information. And so you need to have some specific information to work with. But, they've given us a launching point for that.
So Dan, I wanted to come back to you and say, as a US company, what are the 2 or 3 key things you need to go into this, get a joint venture done, what does the US government need to do to make that happen smoothly as opposed to choppily and much more expeditiously?
Yeah, Deborah, good question. I'm going to start with it is a two-way street, meaning it's not just what the U.S. government can do, but it's also what the Ukrainian government can do. And I know we've had conversations at the executive level on doing co-production or sharing of technology or sharing of TTPs or what we call tactics, techniques, and procedures. I know that's ongoing. I haven't seen that actually down at my level yet, at the business level in activation. But I think that's one piece of it is the Ukrainians have to also agree on limitations or releasing or relaxing some of their export controls that allow it easier for us to partner with Ukrainian firms to either do co-production in Europe or even co-production in the United States and ship them back. Preferably the closer to the borders of Ukraine, the better. That's one. The second, as I already mentioned, and this is related to that, is the Denmark model, I think, is a good start point where you have a nation state in Europe that is now in the already doing exactly that. Under the agreement with Ukraine and Denmark, it is creating the opportunity, at least for Danish companies in partnership with Ukrainian companies, to be able to scale up production in Denmark. If we had something like that in the United States, or even as a U.S. company that's postured in Europe, I could do this in a European country in partnership with local partners. I would do that. And then the third thing, I think, as I mentioned already, I can't emphasize this enough, is a standardization in a bunch of parts that can be readily made available to multiple partners. As it is right now, and I think Kyla will tell us, is there's many Ukrainian companies that are manufacturing their own inside. In fact, they're reverse engineering some of the China technologies on cameras and thermals and those things there to do it themselves. Probably still costs a little bit more, but that's another piece of production that they shouldn't necessarily have to do there in Ukraine while they're in the middle of the fight, when you can take a lot of that and start doing some of those things outside of the country. That's I think what I'll pause there for any other comments or questions.
And so, Nick, I'm going to give you the last thing before we open up to the audience. So you're on the front lines. What is the longest problem, the thing that is most difficult when you need to access a piece of equipment, when you need to access a component, and when you see something that says, electronically, this is being jammed, I need to do this, I need to get something that disrupts those signals, I need to do something. What is that timeline? If you were to say, what do I need to fix so that you, as someone who's out there fighting the fight every day, can get your job done? What are those 2 or 3 things that need to be fixed?
Like, in my opinion, especially if take our regiment example, we are very have a good connection with our developer who are making our main weapon for us. We was growing up together because it was our main weapon when we just was a battalion. And because of that, like, it was very nice to, when we have some problems or some, for example, GPS model was not actual on the front line, we just gave a fast, quick feedback to our developer, and he tried to find maximum fast decision to find the different one which will work. And it's nice kind of communication. What for different components from US and European, like we are wanted to, this communication line should be much more shorter actually, because sometimes it takes really long period waiting while it will be some decision about it. With Ukrainian, it's a bit easier. And this concept, I think, should be scaling, like very close networking between the units and manufacturing. It really works really good. But about the supply chain and our dependence from the China, I personally understood if Chinese will make a decision to stop supplying the components to Ukraine, it will be a very big problem to the frontline area what we have now. So yeah, globally, we should work on the networking between the Ukrainian, US, and European manufacturing, making short distance between each other, as co-production is super good idea, because it's good for both sides. We have the one enemy, and enemy is scaling up very fast. They have a huge amount of resources. For example, you see the Shahed technology. It's a deep strike, which they took actually from Iran, and scaling up so fast, we have a super much problem they're using the Shaheds. For sure, yeah, we are, especially our regiment are making interceptoring. Want to tell thank you that one of our interceptor is coming from US, and it's really, we made a really good result with this. We were starting this interception company using really good US interceptor and with combination radar and our ground group. So yeah, just make a shorter distance and understand that we should all work together, and less bureaucracy, more effectivity and networking, direct networking.
Thank you, that's very useful. We do have a microphone here, so if anyone has any questions, please come up to the mic. And please identify yourself.
Yes. Hi, I'm Sidney Friedberg from BreakingDefense.com, and very indirectly by way of Latvia on my father's side, so I have some built-in sympathy. Let me ask, one thing that came up a few times kind of in passing is there's still actually a lot of US export restrictions that impact and this. What are the things that the State Department, if we still have one next week, could do to improve that, and what could Congress, which presumably will be around, could actually do? Is there, how much of the problem can be solved, at the stroke of a pen, as it were, as opposed to the problems that are perhaps, deeply rooted because the U.S. in particular is offshored its ability to actually build anything besides making lattes? Well, and more language models.
I mean, I wish I knew the answer. So I'll just comment that, from my old perch, where I was handling security assistance, when we would make the decision to provide something to Ukraine, it actually goes through different channels than items that are being purchased by Ukraine or any other country in the world. It's the defense commercial sales process versus the security assistance process. So in some areas, some of these challenges aren't even very visible to leadership levels, which in and of itself is a problem, I would say.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Jessica Sobieski. I'm with the Institute for the Study of War. And today I wanted to ask about, so this presentation has focused on aerial systems. Are you seeing the same issues with unmanned ground vehicles? And if you're not seeing some of the same issues, if you're able to continue that production, is there a way that you can use those to replace some of the aerial drones? So like they're being used for like evacuations or logistics instead of kind of trying to like produce aerial drones. Like, is there a way to kind of manage around some of the supply chain issues in that way?
Yeah, it's a good question. The short answer is no. These issues are persistent across all domains, and in the bigger report, actually, I focused on aerial systems in the presentation, but we actually talk about naval systems, ground systems, and all of basically any kind of unmanned system. It's not easily replaceable because if you're thinking about the supply chain for an FPV drone, which is probably one of the most critical things that we're working on right now, the type of communication and navigation systems that an FPV drone needs that is still reliant on China is not always the same communication and navigation module that an unmanned ground vehicle would have, or especially a USV. On the surface, you have a completely different type of radio link when you're communicating on water. But they are all, because we're kind of looking at it from the components level, they all face the same critical bottlenecks because things like batteries, lithium is a really big restriction, and so even though we have lithium battery packs in FPV drones, like a lot of those batteries are used in other systems as well, or the communications models, the antennas, they all come from more or less the same source, so it's not just aerial systems that are affected.
Dan, I see you nodding. Did you want to pipe in on this one? Dan? I don't know if we've lost the audio here.
No, yeah, I'm sorry. I was nodding because I was leaning in trying to hear better. There's a little bit of an audio challenge here.
All right, I apologize. Can we have the next question?
Hello, my name's Joe Ware. I'm from Applied Intuition Defense, and I just now returned from Ukraine, which is an awesome country, by the way. Awesome food, awesome people, and just a beautiful, beautiful place. So while I was there, we were looking at ways on how we could assist the Ukraine Defense Force. And one way that we think we can do is, as our thesis, is that we can partner with Ukraine UAS companies to provide our autonomous software to them in support of the overarching Ukraine Defense Force. Some of our takeaways, you mentioned scale, but what we kind of came away from our site survey was that each that unmanned unit has its own procurement system, and it's almost a sovereign unit or army unto itself. So if you want scale, then you have to get scale. And so it's a little bit trouble when a company wants to go in there, then you have to find all these different stakeholders to try to get your product into the products that they want as a software provider. So that's one thing. And then predictable funding. Businesses want predictable funding. We want to know that our investment is going to actually get a return on that investment. And so I don't think Ukraine is in a position to provide that predictable funding, but if somebody like the United States, in particular, if we could get predictable funding from them, that would be beneficial. And lastly, so I have a strong security assistance background, and typically it's like, hey, we'll give Ukraine 155s, or we'll give them this in unit. Well, I think we should change the way we think of security assistance in that you want to help the Ukraine Defense Industrial Base. Well, companies like us, which is autonomy software companies, which can make those systems much more lethal, we would take a fraction of that security assistance. We're talking about $1 million or millions of dollars to help us integrate into a Ukraine system to make those systems much more lethal, and you're enhancing the defense industrial base in Ukraine, and then setting them up for success afterward to export to other markets throughout the world. So that's it. Thank you.
So, Kat, I think this is the first part, and then lead it to your second and third part here is really critical, which is that what kind of effort needs to happen in Ukraine to routinize this effort so that you're not having 16 different procurement things to go through, because I believe the software piece is critically important here, because that's the stuff you can change very quickly when you need to produce countermeasures and the like. And so having a bottleneck for that really does impact your ability to fight the enemy. So how would you change that inside Ukraine?
I mean, I think it's complicated, and I'd also like to hear Nick's thoughts on this as well, and procurement in the Army and how that can be improved. But I think we're trying to balance the fine line of decentralized procurement has brought a lot to us and has really changed the way that we're able to fight, and it's probably one of the big advantages we have right now. But yes, we see an effectiveness sometimes with the decentralized process when companies have trouble figuring out who they need to go to and how they need to get their products procured, and it's not always systematized, and we need some more. I think we need to have a little bit more of like a universality applied to the types of products that we're using on the battlefield. But what is interesting about the decentralized process is that now Army units are increasingly leaning towards their own production, right? So most of the major brigades, the major corps have their own R&D labs, have their own little manufacturing plants, some of them not so little. They're able to produce these systems on their own, and what they do need is to procure the individual components part of it. And they're able to assemble themselves. They know what needs to be assembled. They also know what they need. And so I think that there's a really good opportunity here of governments or having some sort of centralized program stepping in and realizing that the requirements coming from the front line and the type of technologies that the units need change all the time. And that makes it really hard to buy entire systems and to buy entire units. But what doesn't change is the parts that go into those. You mix and match. If you're changing the software to adapt to some kind of electronic warfare every week, the frame of the drone that you're using stays more or less the same. Like the FPV drone is the FPV drone. You change the antenna, you change the VTX, you change the software, but you know you're going to need the propellers, you know you're going to need the motors. So there's an opportunity here to maintain our decentralized procurement in the sense that, you know, units can still have their individual liaisons, they can still find the systems that they need, but the government might have an effective program in stepping in to provide the components for their R&D shops and for their manufacturing because they know best what they need.
And I think that's a really important point. And Nick, I do want to hear from you on this because components perhaps can be bought at volume. And they would have multiple implications and applications, I should say, across a variety of systems. And I think there is where companies will want to work through the government to have that one-stop shopping to where they can get this. Nick, your take on this?
Like, if the truth, I'm so focusing on a battle work for last 2 years, then I don't want to tell about the things where I'm not an expert. So, like, as for me, it's really nice if government will make a conditions, comfortable conditions for companies, for foreign manufacturers who want to come and help us. And also, we had a practice in our regiment with direct connections. First, let's make just unofficial, like we are starting communication about some technology, they are bringing it to us, we are testing it, for example, firstly in for example, Kyiv region polygon conditions, we are testing it, that made a battle test, and when if became success decision, we see the result on the battlefield. It became the procedure where I don't know how it works in the government level connection bureaucracy. So yeah, I'm more about the practice decision, what is works. If it works, our commanding helps to make it all, like make a deal and started working with this. Like an example with Interceptor, what I mentioned before.
I want to add here just one quick note that I hear the frustrations from private companies that say, you know, we have to deal with a lot of different procurement systems, we have to deal with a lot of different units, but I think Nick's point is really important to remember that these systems are getting used in the field, and the MOD, having a centralized procurement process, the MOD doesn't know what's working and what's not. They can't go out on the field, test it themselves, do these kinds of operations and understand. So it's a really important part of the feedback loop because we're in a situation where, yes, you need to come to the individual unit. The individual unit needs to use your product, and that's the validation. And then sometimes it gets pulled up the chain, sometimes you contract with the individual unit, but it's an incredibly important part of our process because that's how we know that we're using systems that are going to help us on the battlefield.
Okay, so we have about a minute left, so quick wrap up here. I'm going to go to Dan. You want to say, you have about 20 seconds here.
Yeah, I'll just, both Katerina and Mick, I mean, they hit it on the head. Necessity is the mother of invention, and the decentralization of the process is really the genius in how Ukraine has been so successful with drones. This is probably the first really military event where you actually have scientists and engineers literally on the ground with operators learning as they go, and then cycling that information back into the new productions of new models. But you're still using standardized parts for most of the things. You're just tweaking things to make it a little bit better to perform differently, given the battlefield circumstances that may vary from location to location.
Thanks. Okay, we have about, each of you have 5 seconds now. I'm watching the clock here.
I just leave on this note of how important this is to NATO and how important this is to the United States that we get this partnership right. I think that right now on the eastern flank, we'd all like to see a whole heck of a lot of interceptor drones instead of these expensive missiles being used to shoot at Russian incoming drones.
Okay, I'm going to wrap it up here. Thank you so much for coming in person and webbing in virtually today. And a hand of applause for our very good panelists.